Well, my early Slavic video wasn't the best, so let's revisit the topic by looking at probably the most historically prominent early Slavic theory, which is the Slavic-Venetic connection. Also, depending on the translation, the name can be spelled multiple of ways. So, Veneti were actually three tribes in history: a Celtic tribe living in Brittany, an obscure Indo-European tribe living in northeastern Italy, which is the reason why today this region is called Veneto and why Venice is called Venice, but I digress. And lastly, the Veneti living east of the Vistula River, also known as the Vistula Veneti. Before we look at the Vistula Veneti, we have to address the fact that there are seemingly three completely different tribes with the same name. Now, this is mostly credited to two things. One is that we know the names of all these tribes because Romans wrote it down, and they didn't always ask the people what they actually called themselves, so this could easily just be a Roman unimaginative naming scheme reusing names of different tribes in different areas. It's not like the Romans were particularly known for their tactness when naming other people. Another explanation, and also one that could play a role along with the first explanation, is that Veneti originates from an old Indo-European word, meaning it wouldn't be far-fetched to see multiple Indo-European tribes, no matter how far removed, using it. However, with all that said, what needs to be stressed is that none of these three Venetic tribes had anything in common other than that they spoke a variation of an Indo-European language, with the Breton Veneti speaking Celtic, the Italian Veneti Proto-Italic, and the Vistula Veneti, well, we don't know. So let's look at the Vistula Veneti. The first mention of the Vistula Veneti comes from the 1st century CE in Pliny's Natural History, and all he says is that they are a Sarmatian group that lives somewhere near the Baltic Sea east of the Vistula. Not much to go off of. Second mention is from Tacitus's Germania, who also puts the Veneti somewhat clumsily east of the Vistula, somewhere near the Baltic Sea. He also says they have settled homes, carry shields, and are fond of traveling on foot. Again, not much to really go by. He also classifies the Veneti as a Germanic tribe, but Tacitus's classifications should be taken with a grain of salt, as he set out in his book to classify every tribe northeast of Rome as either Germanic or Sarmatian, which means even if the Vistula Veneti were Slavic, Tacitus would still classify them as either Germanic or Sarmatian. The last ancient mention of the Vistula Veneti comes from the 2nd century Ptolemy's Geographia. In it, Ptolemy again puts the Veneti somewhere east of the Vistula near the Baltic Sea, but he also puts some Veneti at the Baltic Sea, next to the Gulf of Gdansk. And those are all the ancient sources about the Vistula Veneti, with the only thing all three sources agree on being the location of where the Veneti lived, and not even fully, as Pliny and Tacitus put the Veneti near the Baltic Sea, while Ptolemy puts some of the Veneti at the Baltic Sea, whilst others just near it. This could be due to the passage of time and the fact that Ptolemy was writing roughly 50 to 100 years later from the others, meaning that some of the Veneti could have moved into the Gulf of Gdansk during that time, but we just don't know. Now that we have established the baseline from the ancient sources, we have to look at the smoking gun, if you will, of the Slavic-Veneti connection. This smoking gun comes in form of a 6th century Eastern Roman bureaucrat turned historian, Jordanes. Jordanes wrote a book called Getica, which was a shortened version of a Cassiodorus' 12-volume work on the history of the Goths. And because history is a cruel mistress, of course the one book by Jordanes survived and the 12-volume work by Cassiodorus has been lost to time. This statement is made even further upsetting by the fact that today's Jordanes' one book is the only surviving source on the early history of the Goths we have. But wait, it gets even worse. Even if we disregard the fact that Jordanes' book leaves out a lot of stuff, as it is a summary of a 12-volume work, Jordanes himself isn't a very good historian. He was a bureaucrat to start off with, and his book is littered with references to the contemporary state of politics in Byzantium. He even in some passages confuses the Dacians and Thracians with the Goths. But despite all these mistakes, he still nonetheless wrote a book which is very valuable to us and gets a lot of things correct. And in that book there's one simple line. Beginning at the source of the Vistula, the populous race of the Veneti dwell, occupying a great expanse of land. Though their names are now dispersed amid various clans and places, they are chiefly called Sclaveni and Antes. Sclaveni and Antes are known Byzantine names for the Slavs being first used by Procopius, who with Jordanes is the first person to ever mention the Slavs in a written record. So that's it. Jordanes said the Slavs were known previously as the Veneti, hence the ancient Veneti were in fact Slavs, right? Well, as you can see by the length of this video, not quite. Jordanes, as mentioned before, has made mistakes when classifying other people groups, so naturally we have to be skeptical of his Venetic statement and have to analyze it in the context of other sources. This is problematic because Jordanes is the only known medieval writer to mention that the Slavs were previously called Veneti. Procopius, Agathias, John of Malalas, etc., none of them ever mentioned that the Slavs were known as Veneti, but this fact was completely ignored by early modern Slavic historians who took Jordanes at face value. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the rise of Slavic nationalism along with nation-states, all of whom saw the historical connection to their new movements, and historical accuracy be damned, they will find it no matter what. Shafarik went as far as to say that all modern nations must have had an ancestor in the ancient world, a statement which Jordanes' work was happily supporting for the Slavs. A quick side note here, the Slavic Venetic connection is actually the most normal historical thing to come out of this movement. For example, it was during this time that Serbians decided that they actually lived in the Balkans for 6,000 years or something, an absolutely inaccurate statement that I still get comments about. Nonetheless, this movement wasn't born from nothing. It was part of a greater reactionary movement trying to legitimize the Slavic ethnicities to the Western nations who up until fairly recently viewed the Slavs as, and I quote, an intellectually inferior race of obscure Asiatic origin. This is why the Slavic Venetic connection was happily accepted by the Slavs, because it not only gave the Slavs a decisive European origin, but also history dating back to the Roman era, which in their eyes gave them more legitimacy. And since the Slavic Venetic connection was now considered as truth, such a truth most certainly must have an archaeological proof just waiting to be found. So during most of the 20th century, many Slavic nations exerted a lot of academic effort towards finding an archaeological proof for a Slavic Venetic connection, including the USSR, who used the connection as a propaganda piece to stimulate unity amongst the Slavic communist states. As you may have figured out by now, no clear-cut archaeological connection was found, and to explain it I will have to go on a very large side note. I promise I will circle back. So the earliest Slavic archaeological culture types, dating back to the late 5th and early 6th centuries, are defined by distinct Prague-type pottery, cremation burial, etc. It's called the Prague-type pottery group, and it is subdivided into multiple distinct archaeological cultures. Archaeological culture types, or material culture types, like the various Prague-type pottery cultures, are defined by a similarity of recurring archaeological materials or observable customs in a certain area. This does not necessarily mean that archaeological culture types can always define an actual existing ethnicity in a certain area, as they can only define greater archaeological trends. After all, two different ethnicities could leave very similar archaeological remnants. However, duck logic does apply here, meaning if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Going back to the various Prague-type pottery cultures, how similar or different they were is currently a matter of debate, as relying on pottery isn't the most accurate. Therefore, people like Kurta are very skeptical at classifying all these culture types as Slavic. However, considering all these Prague-type pottery culture groups emerge at the same time as we get the first written record about the Slavs and their migrations by Procopius and other historians, if it looks like a duck, so on. I also want to stress that no historians, even Kurta, argue that all Prague-type pottery cultures aren't Slavic. The debate is whether all of the Prague-type pottery cultures were only Slavic, or if some of them were a mixture of multiple ethnicities, or even some not being Slavic at all and only just adopting the customs and technology of the culture type. Nevertheless, the Prague-type pottery cultures, if not all, at least some, are still the first non-debatable Slavic archaeological culture types. So to understand how we could possibly connect these archaeological cultures to earlier ones, we have to look at the state of Eastern Europe around the 1st and 2nd centuries. Now, thanks to historians like aforementioned Pliny and Tacitus, we can very accurately define the borders and border tribes of the Roman Empire, but naturally the further out you go from the borders of the Roman Empire, the harder it gets to define what kind of tribes lived where, because Romans didn't really write much about them, which leaves us with a lot of one-off mentions of tribes like the Veneti. So with that in mind, let's look at the three most important archaeological culture types to us in the 1st and 2nd century, those being the Wilbark culture, the Przeworsk culture, and the Zarubinci culture. In the latter half of the 2nd century, we see a very large and explosive expansion of the Wilbark culture into the lands of the Przeworsk culture, which subsequently moved more south, and Zarubinci culture, whose western half got subsequently absorbed into the Wilbark culture, and the eastern half pushed more eastwards, where it transformed into the Kiev culture type. Then at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century, Wilbark culture expanded even more southward, merging with the various Sarmatian, remnants of Zarubinets, and Dacian culture types, creating a new culture type, the Chernyakov. The Wilbar culture then, even though persisting in some areas like Pomerania until the 5th century, drastically declined in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Przeworsk culture type started to decline in the 4th century and ended in the 5th century. The Cherniakov culture type didn't see much decline, however it also ended abruptly in the 5th century. All I just talked about right now were changes and migrations of archaeological culture types, which as stated before does not necessarily mean a migration of people groups, but if we combine these culture types with historical records, a certain pattern starts to emerge. First, the migration of Goths started at the mouth of the Vistula, well, maybe Scandinavia, but we don't have time to get into that debate. Second, south of the Goths were the Vandals. Third, the Goths attacked the Vandals and maybe other Germanic tribes who then exerted pressure on the tribes bordering Rome, who then under this pressure started the Roman Marcomannic Wars in 166 to 180. All of this dating coincides with the Wilbar culture pushing of Przeworsk culture more southward. Fourth, when the Vandals emerged in Pannonia, it was from the area of the Przeworsk culture, plus they said they came to Pannonia because Goths pushed them there. Fifth, in the 3rd century, Goths established a political entity in southern Ukraine from which they conducted their first raid into Rome in 236 and only ramped up from there. This timing coincides with the Cherniakov culture type emergence in southern Ukraine. Sixth, of these culture types, as mentioned before, seem to end all at the same time in the 5th century, which is the time when the Huns arrived in Central Europe. Lastly, there's the fact that runic inscriptions in Elder Futhark were found in areas dominated by Wilbark, Cherniakov and Przeworsk cultures. So in the end, if it looks like a duck, you get my point. Now, all of this is not without its caveats. For example, the Przeworsk and Cherniakov cultures existed way after Goths and Vandals went and basically helped the Roman Empire to end. Plus, both of these culture types had certain other characteristics. Przeworsk had not only Germanic, but also some Slavic and Celtic and other characteristics, while Cherniakov also had not only Germanic, but also some Slavic, Sarmatian, and in the western half, Dacian characteristics. But remember, these are archaeological culture types, they again don't necessarily mean the movement of people groups. For example, the Przeworsk culture type could have easily been started by the Vandals, but after they left, it could have continued with the different people groups that they left behind, or maybe some Vandals decided to stay behind, or the culture type could have been adopted by people who came in after the Vandals, or most likely, all of these factors played a role all at once. We just don't know exactly. In the end, I, with many other historians, are just pointing out the certain patterns that can be seen in the archaeological culture type movements when combined with the written records. But what does any of these Germanic migrations and archaeological cultures have to do with the Slavic-Venetic connection? Well, all of these culture types mentioned have at one point or another been called Slavic and been called the remnants of the Slavic Veneti, which for some of these cultures is completely ridiculous, because the Cherniakov culture isn't even near the Baltic Sea, the Wilbar culture doesn't have any Slavic characteristics, and the Kiev culture is near the Dnieper, not the Vistula, etc. But when you look at the people who peddled these statements, it becomes clear it's a nationalistic issue, with Cherniakov culture being promoted by Ukrainians and Russians, Przeworsk and Wilbar cultures by Poles, and so on. However, if you look past all this, two culture types seem to emerge, the Zarubinets and later Kiev. Kiev is at this point pretty much accepted to be a predecessor to the Slavic Prague-type pottery culture, as the area it was located in is also the area where the oldest Prague-type pottery culture materials were found, but what is debated is if the Kiev culture emerged from Zarubinets like I have previously mentioned. Maybe linguistics can help us find an answer to this. When it comes to the Slavic linguistics, two very influential works are by Rostafinsky and Trubachev. Rostafinsky was the first person to notice that all Slavic languages lack certain words that relate to seafaring or particular plants like large and new. Instead, all Slavic languages use borrowed words from mainly Germanic, but also sometimes Latin or Sarmatian languages to describe these plans or seafaring actions. This means that the Slavic language evolved in a landlocked area where the Slavs didn't have access to the sea and plans like larch or yew didn't exist. Such an area in fact does lie in Europe, and it's called Polesia, just straddling the Belarusian and Ukrainian border and a bit of Poland. This coincidentally is also where the Zarubinets culture and later partly Kiev culture existed. Rostafinsky was then supported in this by Trubachev, who found the oldest Slavic hydronyms and toponyms north of the upper Dniester and west of the middle Dnieper. And this is where I will mention our last archaeological source that I have been saving until now. Kobylinski, a Polish archaeologist, wrote about the occurrence and spread of hill forts in Eastern Europe. He showed that in Poland, the characteristic Slavic hill fort settlements didn't occur before the 6th century. However, after the 6th century, we can see spread of these hill forts across Poland, Eastern Germany, etc. And these hill forts came to Poland You guessed it, from Polesia, where they can be dated to as far back as the 2nd century. Some of these forts were also found in northern Dnieper, which could be due to the forced move of Zarubinets culture more eastwards by the Wilbar culture. Interestingly, these hill forts in Polesia seem to originate from Latvia, where the forts can be dated as far back as the 5th century BCE. This evidence could maybe link to a Balto-Slavic tribe. After all, Baltic is the closest language relative to Slavic in the Indo-European family tree. But in the end, this is hard to tell. The further back you go, the less evidence there is and the more possibilities there are. But taking the last stated fact aside for now, the linguistic evidence, the archaeological evidence, and the spread of hill forts across Europe from Polesia around the same time when written records tell us of a Slavic migration does seem to support the Slavic presence in said area before the emergence of the Kiev culture type, meaning the Zarubinets culture is most likely Slavic. This culture type existed during the same time as the Veneti were said to exist in an area which is east of the Vistula but not really near the Baltic Sea, where the Veneti were said to live. However, there is still one more linguistic puzzle piece that needs to be looked at. The Germanic word to denote the Slavs in the Middle Ages was Vende, or Vender, or Vent, but most notably just Vent, which does seem very close to the name Veneti. This is why many proponents of the Slavic-Veneti connection point to this fact as the proof that the Veneti were Slavs. Otherwise, why would the Germanic people call the Slavs Vents? Well, it is not uncommon for tribes in history to adopt the name of the tribe that lived in the area before them. Plus, it's not like the Veneti, if they weren't Slavic, would have just disappeared suddenly. No, they would have been just absorbed into the Slavic population over time, so calling the Slavs Veneti wouldn't have been completely wrong. Lastly, there are no early sources for the Slavs actually calling themselves Veneti or Vents. In the early stages, the word Vents was only used by Western Germanic chroniclers to classify the Slavs, not by Slavs themselves, which would further support the fact that the Germanic chroniclers just adopted the name of the former tribe that was on their eastern border to describe the new tribe that was on their eastern border. Looking at all the evidence, especially linguistic and archaeological, it looks like Jordanes was just wrong, as most things point towards the Slavs being in Polesia. Therefore, in the early 21st century, after the pan-Slavic idealism and communist propaganda had passed, many historians started to view the Slavic-Veneti connection as wrong, harkening back to the words of the first denier of the Slavic-Veneti connection, Josef Dobrovsky, who in 1818 said that Jordanes just named the Slavs Veneti because he found them living in an area where the ancient Veneti lived, not because of any actual ethnic connection. But were the Veneti truly not Slavic? Well, it depends. First is that we don't know the exact extent of the area the Veneti lived in. East of the Vistula near the Baltic Sea can be interpreted multiple ways, and many people put the Veneti as far as Polesia, at which point if the Veneti were really that big, most of the facts seem to point towards the Veneti being Slavic. However, at the same time, the sentence can be interpreted literally, with the Veneti only living exactly east of the Vistula near the Baltic Sea, at which point the Veneti being Slavic is very unlikely, as most linguistic sources and no archaeological sources support it. But that brings us to the second point, which I think is often overlooked, and it is the most likely one. I call this point people have sex with anyone. The nice political boundaries of the modern world we are used to today didn't exist for most of history. A lot of tribes lived amongst each other and with each other. Trying to define an exact area where the Germanic, Sarmatian, Celtic, Slavic tribes lived is impossible. People moved, people lived with one another, people procreated with one another, etc. Of course, there were areas where only one tribe was, but there were many overlapping areas. So with that in mind, the reason why most of Slavic evidence seems to point towards Polesia is because that was the largest and most homogeneous area where the Slavs lived. However, at the same time, the certain Slavic characteristics found in the Cherniakov culture type show a presence of some Slavic tribes, even though the culture type has more Germanic and Sarmatian traits. The same goes with the Persiaworks culture type, and maybe even more that we haven't discovered yet, creating a gradient of early Slavic settlements. And this logic should be applied to not just Slavs but also Germanic tribes and Sarmatian, etc. So the Veneti, who even the ancient sources had trouble classifying due to their mixed nature, seem to have been a mix of multiple tribes, which most likely included Slavs, but it doesn't seem like the Slavs were the majority, with the Veneti being most likely a Germanic-Slavic mix with some Baltic and Sarmatian members, being overall part of the Persiaworks culture type. Then after the Hunnic arrival and their political/social disruption in much of Europe, pushing many of the Germanic groups westwards, the stage was set for the Slavic culture types to emerge, and then freely expand after the Hunnic Federation fell apart, with the Veneti during this tumultuous time being absorbed into the greater Slavic ethnicity and the name being adopted by Western Germanic chroniclers to now describe just the Slavs. Lastly, I'm going to address the topic every layman Slavic historian loves to talk about because I always get comments about it, and that is genetics. Genetics are incapable of proving precise movements of ethnicities. First, it's because ethnicity is a social construct that person's genetics cannot tell you about, like for example if a person in Roman Gaul thought of himself as Roman or Celtic. Second, because genetics operate and show a much larger timescale of thousands of years rather than hundreds or dozens that the migrations we're talking about occurred in. Third, European genetic makeup is far more similar than Europeans would like to believe. After all, most of us speak a variation of an Indo-European language. I will conclude with this statement from a Polish genetic study. The formation of contemporary European ethnic groups, including the Slavs, is a relatively recent process, recent on a genetic timescale. Therefore, mitochondrial DNA analysis did not allow identification of any specific features which would clearly distinguish Slavs from the other European populations. And I know it only talked about mitochondrial DNA haplogroups here, but the same applies to Y chromosome haplogroups. All of this is not to say that genetic studies are invaluable, it's just that they aren't a smoking gun and should be used only as another piece of a greater puzzle, especially when dealing with prehistory. However, as stated, in this case DNA studies sadly cannot help us. Oof, that was a long one. I've been working on this video since November. Hopefully it is much better than my previous Slavic origins video. There's a lot of things I wanted to talk about that I just didn't have the time for, like the history behind some of the Slavic borrowed words, or the so-called Parents X that is on the thumbnail of this video, or the various runic inscriptions found in Eastern Europe, or the overlapping / adoption of archaeological culture types and the way we can tell that some Prague-type pottery culture finds weren't left behind by Slavs, or how some Slavs adopted steppe practices, or how we know that some Slavs were present at the Hunnic court through Slavic loanwords written by Romans who thought they were Hunnic, etc. However, I have a limited amount of time and the video can only be so long, so as always, my scripts with all the sources are available for free on Patreon. There's more information, clarifications and corrections in the pinned comment. You can support me on Patreon, and as always, if you want to see more videos like these, click the bell icon and subscribe. My name is Mlaser, and stick around for history.